Okay, this video series is going to be entitled Pickett's Charge, and this is our first part. Now, around 1:03 p.m. on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, two cannon fired a shot eastward, which began the cannonade of Pickett's charge. Around 3 p.m., following a 2-hour cannonade, the Confederate infantry would then launch a massive frontal assault from this ridge that we're standing on against the center of the Union line, which was directly in front of us along a stone wall. The Confederates who comprised this section of the line were Virginians under the command of Major General George E. Pickett. Now, these Southern Confederate attackers, which were about 12,000 strong, moved forward in a battle line about 1 mile. As they marched across the Emmitsburg Road and approached the Union line, the Federals then began to rake them with canister and musket fire. Nevertheless, without the courage of these men, the Southerners continued to press on. Pickett's men gained a small lodgment in the Union line at the angle, but could not hold it, as the casualties began to mount and the attack lost its momentum. By 4 o'clock, Confederate survivors came streaming back to the shelter of this ridge, and the Confederate tide had reached what we call the high water mark of the Confederacy. And in this video series, we will talk about different aspects of Pickett's charge. This has been part 1 of Pickett's charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield. This is going to be Pickett's charge part 2 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And we are standing here at the Virginia Memorial. This memorial was dedicated on June the 6th, 1917, and it features Major General Robert Edward Lee mounted on his favorite horse, Traveler. Underneath the statue is a group who represents different types who left the civil occupation to join the Confederate Army as Virginians. From left to right, it is a professional man, a mechanic, an artist, a boy, a businessman, a farmer, and a youth. The sculptor of this monument was a man named F.W. Severs, and again, this monument was dedicated on June the 6th, 1917. It was one of the first of the what would later become a Confederate monuments on the battlefield dedicated to the states that fought for the Confederacy during the American Civil War here at the Battle of Gettysburg. The likeness of Robert E. Lee is often considered to be one of the best representations of Robert E. Lee that's ever been sculpted. And again, it sits here on the ridge where General Lee sat atop of his horse, Traveler, and watched as the 12,000 soldiers under Major General Pickett participated in what we would know as Pickett's charge as they crossed this field over here. This has been Pickett's Charge Part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. This is going to be Pickett's Charge Part 3 on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. We're going to point out some vantage points standing here along the ridge of the charge of Pickett's charge, and I'm going to use my finger to point them out. Over here to our left, you see this group of trees here. This was known as Ziegler's Grove, which was one of the more prominent landmarks on Cemetery Ridge. The Confederate Army directed their attack against the section of the Union line that ran from Ziegler's Grove here to the copse of trees. So this first vantage point is Ziegler's Grove. The second one that we're going to look at is actually the Emmitsburg Road. And the Emmitsburg Road can be hard to see, but you see the Bryan farm that I'm pointing at, and every once in a while you'll actually see a car go by the Emmitsburg Road. That was the Emmitsburg Road. The Confederate Army, of course, would cross that road, and then that is where basically they would stop being shot at by cannonade, but then they would start being at a closer range shot by musket, and also by cannon with grape shot and canister. So that's the Emmitsburg Road right there. Our next is going to be right over here where you see this one tree standing by itself, and that would be the angle. And it's there where a stone wall makes a 90-degree turn that the Confederates broke through the Union line at the angle right here. And of course, though they did have a breakthrough, it was defeated, and then they were beaten back across the field. The fourth vantage point would be the center of attack. General Lee wanted to attack the center of the Union line here at what we call the copse of trees, or also known as the clump of trees. If we move a little bit to our left, we're going to look at this fifth spot right up here in the distance, and this is called the Point of Woods. The Point of Woods was a wood line that ran here also with a 90-degree angle. And when Pickett's charge was over and the Southern troops came coming back toward this ridge, this was the area that General Robert E. Lee mounted on Traveler, then rode along the Point of Woods. Today there's a sidewalk that goes out, and he met his retreating troops as they came across the field to console them at the Point of Woods. So that would be our fifth vantage point here on our Pickett's Charge series. And we'll go back and watch and shoot videos at all these points on the other side of the line there at a later time. This has been part 3 of Pickett's Charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Okay, this is going to be Pickett's Charge part 4 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate, and I'm here at the Point of Woods looking over the fields of Pickett's Charge. And now as the Confederates streamed back across the field after their failed attack, Major General Robert Edward Lee rode out to this point where he met his troops. And he was heard to have said that the attack had all been his fault. Now this attack cost his army about 6,000 casualties. With the failure of the charge, General Lee knew that his opportunity for a victory here at Gettysburg was gone. His men were exhausted, and the number of the dead, wounded, and the missing was enormous. They could no longer take the offensive, and they began to think in different terms about retreating. And on July 4th, Lee's men held their position on the ridge that's behind us, and the Federals did not attack them at that point. That evening, General Robert E. Lee would be given the order to the rest of his army to retreat from Gettysburg, officially ending the Battle of Gettysburg. The retreat began in a very heavy rain that had started on the evening of July 3rd, 1863, around 8:30 p.m. This rain soaked the downcast Southern troops, and the high spirits that had carried them into Pennsylvania were dashed on the bloody fields of Gettysburg. One of the stories that I want to tell is that of Lieutenant Thomas C. Holland. Now, he commanded Company G of the 28th Virginia Infantry. Shouting, "Come on, boys," Holland broke through the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. He fell moments later when a bullet pierced his cheek and exited the back of his head. He was carried to a Union field hospital and later recovered. Of the 88 men in Company G of the 28th Virginia who took part in Pickett's charge, 81 of the 88 were listed as killed, wounded, or missing that night. 50 years after the battle, Holland returned to the spot where he fell and shook the hand of a Union soldier that had shot him. This has been Pickett's Charge Part 4 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Okay, this is going to be Part 5 of our video series called Pickett's Charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. And we're going to talk about the soldiers, the Confederate soldiers that made this charge and their location. Here in the distance would have been Wilcox, and Wilcox under his command had the 9th, 10th, 11th, 8th, and 14th Alabama. Behind him, over beyond the Henry Spangler farm, would have been Kemper, who would have been anchored basically right in front of the Spangler farm there, and he would have had the 24th, 11th, 1st, 7th, and 3rd Virginia. Lang and his Floridians would have been out front with the 5th, the 8th, and the 2nd Florida. And then just on this side of the Spangler farm, which you can see on the left center of our camera, just a little bit to the right, where you see those two prominent trees right over here, would have been Garnett's Virginia's brigade, which would have been the 8th, the 18th, the 19th, the 28th, and the 56th Virginia. That would have made the left, or I'm sorry, the right of the Confederate line here during Pickett's charge. This has been Pickett's Charge Part 5 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is going to be Pickett's Charge Part 6 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and we're looking at the placement of Confederate troops during the action of Pickett's charge. Here where our camera's facing, behind the trees here, would have been Armistead's brigade, which consisted of the 14th, the 9th, the 53rd, the 57th, and the 38th Virginia Infantry. And of course, Armistead's brigade would then move out here in this direction and over toward the copse of trees and the angle. The brigade of Lawrence would have been over here and would have been consisting of the 16th, 22nd, 34th, 13th, and 38th North Carolina. That would have been over here in the distance today, where the North Carolina Brigade is. Also, just to his right would have been Fry's brigade under the command of Burkett D. Fry, which was originally Burkett's brigade. The 1st Tennessee, 13th Alabama, 14th Tennessee, 7th Tennessee, and 5th Alabama Battalion. That would be today where the Tennessee Monument is, in between the Tennessee Monument and the North Carolina Monument. And we did take a little look at that in our video series, the 13th Alabama at Gettysburg. These troops, of course, were under Trimble's command, and we will take a look at a little bit more of that line in our next video. This has been Pickett's Charge Part 6 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Hey, this is going to be Pickett's Charge Part 7 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and we're going to take a look at the extreme left of the Pickett's Charge line, the troops under Pettigrew, and also that were here on Seminary Ridge. And we're going to look at the battalion under Lane, the 7th, 37th, 28th, 18th, and 33rd North Carolina was Lane's brigade. In front of him would have been Marshall, 52nd North Carolina, 47th North Carolina, 26th North Carolina, 11th North Carolina. Davis's Brigade, 11th Mississippi, 42nd Mississippi, 55th North Carolina, 2nd Mississippi, Brockenball, 22nd Virginia, 40th Virginia, 47th Virginia, and 55th Virginia. And of course, those troops there under Pettigrew on the extreme left would make up what we know as the Pettigrew and Trimble charge, which would go over here to the left side looking at the angle. The Pettigrew Trimble charge going in this direction here with those troops that I just mentioned a moment ago. And again, this is a basic makeup. It doesn't include all the artillery and movement of the troops, but this is the makeup of the 12,000 soldiers under the command of George E. Pickett that left this Seminary Ridge here on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, and made this famous charge across the field, all converging on that spot there in the center of our camera that we would know as Pickett's charge. Of course, this charge has also been called the Pickett Pettigrew Trimble charge. It's also been called Longstreet's assault, but its name it's most famous for and known by is Pickett's charge. And again, these troops were under the command of Major General George E. Pickett. It happened here on July 3rd, 1863. It was one of the most deadly actions of the American Civil War. And it resulted in the destruction of Pickett's men here with over 6,000 casualties in just a couple of hours here. This has been part 7 of Pickett's charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, this is going to be Pickett's charge part 8 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And anyone who comes out here and walks the fields of Pickett's charge has to feel something. I do want to mention that a soldier from the 11th Virginia had made a quote, and of course the 11th Virginia was under Kemper's command in Pickett's division, and they would have been in this direction charging across the field here toward the copse of trees. And this soldier, his name was Lieutenant John T. James of the 11th Virginia, and after the war he stated, "We gained nothing but glory and lost our bravest men." This field here of Pickett's charge on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, though it does look pretty the same today, it has been altered differently, and it did look different on that afternoon. First off, over here on the left would have been the smoldering ruins of the Bliss Farm. And of course, we did a video series on the Bliss Farm, and not many people realize that a large barn and a farm sat over here, right here on the fields of Pickett's charge. And that barn was hotly contended for on the afternoons of July 2nd and 3rd of 1863. It was set on fire by Union troops. It's one of the only farms destroyed by Union troops during the battle here. And this field would have been not only filled with the smoke of artillery and musket fire, but with the burning of that farm, you know, the burning of high grass and fields from hot shells landing in it. And this farm, in several locations today, and the ground goes down into dips, as you can see here. And that's why at the beginning, as you see the copse of trees, as they start to disappear at our camera as we continue to get down into one of these dips. So as these Confederate soldiers are walking and marching across these fields on July 3rd, 1863, they go through periods as they go into these little swales that go up and down in the ground, and they're still that way today, where they had periods of protection. And that is why which you cannot see the Emmitsburg Road at this point as you could back there along the ridge. That is why the deadliest fighting was when they came out of these swales and entered the Emmitsburg Road. Then they did not have the protection from the artillery any longer, and they were under canister fire from artillery, and now musket fire would rake their ranks and destroy their ranks. I think it is important to come out here and walk across these fields and get a feel for the ground. And back in 1863, the fields had more dips, because if you remember, after the Civil War in the early 1900s, this was also used as Camp Colt, a World War I training camp, and they actually had tanks out here on the ground which had flattened and destroyed some of the landscape of the original Pickett's Charge battlefield here. This has been part 8 of Pickett's Charge here in the middle of the field of Pickett's Charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Alright, we're standing on the field here of Pickett's Charge, and just behind me is the Virginia Memorial, the equestrian statue of General Robert E. Lee and Virginia's Sons, one of the finest examples of bronze work on the Gettysburg battlefield. On this field at 3 p.m. on the 3rd of July, 1863, there was a 2-hour, actually about 1 o'clock, there was a 2-hour cannonade. 2 hours later, the Confederate infantry launched a massive frontal assault from this very ridge against the center of the Union line, about a mile away there on Cemetery Ridge. The Confederate Army that occupied this particular position were Virginians, commanded by Major General George E. Pickett. They were about 12,000 strong, and they surged forward in line of battle, about 1 mile long, from that direction right on through the woods here and down. It was a frontal assault toward the Emmitsburg Road, and Federals fired back with deadly canister and musket fire. Now, canister fire is it looks like a big tomato can that goes down the barrel of a cannon, and it has little balls in it, almost like a shotgun shell. So, and of course, getting fired canister, and then in some cases double canister, produce some very deadly results. Nevertheless, the Confederates pressed on their march toward that copse of trees there about a mile ahead. Pickett's men did gain a small lodgment in the Union line at the angle, but he couldn't hold it. And as the casualties mounted by about 4 p.m., Confederate survivors came streaming back to the shelter that was on this ridge. And the Confederate had reached what we know as the high water mark of the Confederacy. This monument behind us, the equestrian statue of General Robert E. Lee and Virginia's Sons at Gettysburg, it was dedicated in 1917, and it pretty much marks the spot where General Lee watched this Longstreet assault go on. The veterans that are on the front of the monument represent various types who left civil occupations to join the Confederate Army. And from left to right on that bronze work down there, is a professional man, a mechanic, an artist, a boy, a businessman, a farmer, and a youth. This particular monument was dedicated on June 6, 1917. It was done by sculptor F.W. Sievers. Probably the most beautiful image of Robert E. Lee. In fact, many people said that General Lee, that was the best likeness of Lee ever done. So again, this is the Virginia Memorial with General Robert E. Lee mounted above his favorite horse, Traveler, and the tribute to the Sons of Virginia, the bronze work below, at the fields of Pickett's charge from the position that Lee watched them on July 3rd, 1863, between the hours of 1 and 4 p.m. And while we're over here, we're going to take a look at this battery of guns here. This is the Army of Northern Virginia Hills Corps, Pender's Division, and this is Ward's Battery. It's the Mississippi Light Artillery. It's 3 Napoleons and 1 12-pound howitzer. We're going to go ahead and just be silent here for a minute and take a look at these guns. And this one particular gun here, actually before I talk about it, these Napoleon's 12-pound howitzers, they were placed in position about 400 yards east of here on July 2nd, which would be looking in front of us. On the 3rd, they participated in the operations of Longstreet's assault. And then, of course, on the 4th, they retreated with the army to Hagerstown. This one particular gun here, actually, one of the secrets is it got hit during the battle and has a dent in it. This gun took a direct hit, and it's one of the few guns on the Gettysburg Park that were used in the battle that have battle damage done to them. And if you're looking at the gun, it is the first gun to the left side of the 4, and you can see the 4 in line here. It's the first gun on the left side standing behind the Virginia Memorial, and if you walk around the other side of the gun here, you'll see the dent and the battle damage that the gun took. And on the front of it, it has its serial number here, or is that, it's up here, I'm sorry, and then the year, 1863. This has been a video of the Virginia Memorial and the Napoleon howitzers of Ward's Battery and the Napoleon guns of Ward's Battery here on Confederate Avenue, and the actions that took part on Longstreet's assault with his charge on July 3rd, 1863. Okay, we're standing here on the Emmitsburg Road. In the distance is the General Lee Monument. This is the field across what Pickett's charge happened. There's the copse of trees in front of us. I'm just bringing it in a little bit closer look to the Emmitsburg Road area so you can see the copse of trees up closer. But the real reason for this video is a little known fact that not many people know about. As you look at the copse of trees and then you go over here toward the angle, okay, if you turn left to where the old cyclorama was at, you're going to see this huge pine tree right here. Now this area right here, this field, during World War I in 1918 was a camp. It was Camp Colt. And actually Camp Colt, they had tanks and such out here on this field where they trained. This tree was planted in 1954 by the United States Army Tank Corps. That marks the spot of Camp Colt, which was the birthplace of the Tank Corps, United States Army, in 1918. The tree that's planted here was actually planted in soil of all of the 48 states that existed at that time. And it was dedicated to the commanding officer, Captain Dwight D. Eisenhower, who on January 2nd of 1953 was inaugurated 34th President of the United States. So this this tree is a living testimonial of his 1918 tank corps comrades. So this tree here, which is on the old site of Camp Colt on the Gettysburg National Military Park, and at the high water mark, is a tree that was planted in 1954, just a year after he became inaugurated as the 34th President of the United States. Though it's not a witness tree, it is a historic tree because of its soil planting. It's the only tree in the United States that has been planted in soil from 48 states. And of course, at that time, there wasn't the state of Alaska and Hawaii in our union, so those two soils ceased to exist from this tree. But this is the tank corps tree, and it sits here right in the shadow of the angle and the copse of tree there in the distance, and about a mile or so from where Robert E. Lee Monument, Virginia Monument, stands out there on West Confederate Avenue, and at the scene of Pickett's charge, which was also the scene of a 1918 tank corps camp called Camp Colt. This has been Off the Beaten Path, and once again, as always, I thank you for watching our videos. Okay, this is sure to be a favorite. We are standing here about at the 1/3 waypoint on the Pickett's charge area of the battlefield. There on the left side of your screen, you can see the Virginia Memorial General E. Lee. And I was told not to pan so fast, so I'm going to slow it up here a little bit. And thanks, by the way, for the tip. But as I pan over here, on the very right-hand side, you're going to see the copse of trees and the Emmitsburg Road there in the distance. This might be one last look at the old Cyclorama building. I can see it out there with the wrecker tearing it down. But this is the Pickett's Charge part of the battlefield. And if you can imagine, on July 3rd, 1863, as we now pan across the woods line, with Schultz Woods and McMillan Woods and all the different names of the woods that go across this field, there were approximately 15 to 20,000 Confederate troops, infantry, that were posted in the woods line along this tree, with General Lee being about in the center here, observing the battle from that point where the Virginia Monument stands. And about 1 p.m. in the afternoon of July 3rd, artillery pieces, over 150 of them, started to fire from along those wood lines. And of course, advanced artillery up a little bit closer, such as this over here, began to fire on Cemetery Ridge at the copse of trees. And when nearing the artillery, Lee gave the command to go down the line to begin the infantry attack. And these 15,000 men from all different states across the South began their charge/walk across the field, which, if you've ever walked this field, the field goes in dips. For instance, right there in the distance, you can see a very deep dip. And then it goes up and then down. This field slopes up and down and up and down. And if you come to Gettysburg sometime, I definitely recommend that you come out here and make that 1 mile walk from the General Lee Monument, or the Virginia Monument rather, all the way up to the angle of the wall and the copse of trees. Make that walk, and you'll see why this attack happened. You'll also see why, other than artillery, the infantry didn't open up for quite some time. Because as these men walked across these large dips in the field, when you get down into those dips, you cannot see anything up there. You can't see the Cyclorama building, even at the height it is. You cannot see the copse of trees, the Emmitsburg Road, or anything. So for Union infantry to fire, or even artillery pieces to fire at this point on the field, is pretty well worthless, and it would have been a waste of ammunition. So these 15,000 men began making this trek across the field. And as they do, I'm actually going to walk into that first dip. In the distance there, you can see the copse of trees, you can see the Cyclorama building, and you can see some cars going down the Emmitsburg Road. These 15,000 men
these Confederate soldiers made this walk across the field, and of course later it was into a double step, but they made this walk across the field, and it wasn't until they got closer up near the Emmitsburg Road that the infantry opened up fire on them. Now, of course, they were blocked by the fence on the road, which slowed them up, bottlenecked them. The infantry opens fire heavily, and that's where most of the casualties began to take. And what happens is the Confederates from the extreme left end of the line, as well as the infantrymen from the right end of the line, actually all angled in, almost like a triangle, toward the copse of trees in the angle. And of course the men coming from where the Virginia men are going straight. So this is like a huge wedge, because again, Lee's battle plan was that the Union was weakened on the first and second day on both flanks, took men from the center to reinforce those flanks, and that he was weak in the center. So Lee's plan was to attack the center, but not only to attack it, but to put all his forces into that center attack and into a weak spot, and then be able to open up a hole which then he could roll the entire Union army up like a scroll. Now here I am at this first dip. I'm going to try to step into it even though it is extremely muddy out here. Of course it's still winter and the grounds are wet. But as I step into this dip, you're going to see the Emmitsburg Road, the copse of trees just disappear. They're no longer there. Even artillery fire wouldn't have much of an effect in a position like this. Now, after crossing the Emmitsburg Road and coming under heavy infantry fire, Confederate soldiers beginning to go down. In droves. And that's when the battle started going into disarray. Brigades are no longer sticking together. Regiments are no longer sticking together. Companies are no longer sticking together. And as the battle goes into disarray, troops are brought from almost any regiment to fill in holes in the line. Now, most of the Confederate commanders were on the field. Pickett's over here at the Cordori home in Barnstead. General Lee is watching the battle. Longstreet not far away. Pettigrew, Armistead. A lot of your commanders are out here on the battlefield fighting or keeping close watch on what's going on. And as they cross that road and make that one last trek up that empty ground to that stone wall, much like the Confederates must have knew that the same thing was going to happen to them that happened to the Union Army at Fredericksburg. Because at Fredericksburg, the Confederates had the high ground, and the Union was charging up an open hill. As this last part of the attack happens, Confederates started going down, their commanding officer started going down, and it was soon realized that the ridge would hold, especially with troops from other corps just waiting to be put into the battle that hadn't been put into battle. It was often said that the action of Pickett's charge, the Federal Army fought with one hand behind its back, that at any time they simply could have just brought out those other corps in hiding and crushed them. As the Confederates streamed back across the fields from their failed assault, Robert E. Lee rode out to meet him. "It has all been my fault," he was heard to say. And he realized that the attack had cost his army 6,000 of some of his best and bravest soldiers. With the failure of Pickett's charge, Lee sensed that all opportunity for a victory here at Gettysburg was gone. His men were exhausted, and the number of dead, wounded, and missing was enormous. They could no longer take the offensive. It now became a defensive objective, and a protection for a retreat. So on the 4th of July, the day after Pickett's charge, Lee's men held their position on the ridge behind us, which is over here. but the Federals did not attack. Meade did not attack them, and that was probably a mistake. Meade rather also felt that his army was exhausted and worn out, so some some wisdom can say that he was smart not to attack. However, in Civil War history, there were plenty of times where exhausted men fought. We talked about that yesterday on the South Cavalry, where some Georgia soldiers that had fought in the wheat field and Devil's Den the day before still were strong enough not only to fight but to fend off a cavalry attack. Meade doesn't attack Lee. He holds his position on July 4th, and Lee that evening gave the order that his army would retreat. The retreat began in a heavy rain that soaked these already downcast, depressed Southern troops. The high spirits that had lifted them here to battle from their amazing victories at Chancellorsville and carried them into the north into Pennsylvania were dashed on the bloody fields of Gettysburg, finishing with this action here on July 3rd, 1863, between 1 and 4 p.m. This has been Pickett's Charge. Okay, we are standing here at the copse of trees, also known as the high water mark, here at the highest point of penetration by the Confederates on July 3rd, 1863. And in front of us is the high water mark Confederate monument that honors all the commands of the Confederacy in recognition of their patriotism and gallantry as a result of Longstreet's assault. Marking the spot of objective from General Lee, the Virginia Monument that sits about a mile behind it in the distance. It is one of the only spots on the Gettysburg battlefield left that the cannon stand with the type of ammunition that they fired next to them. Behind it is the double canister regiment of Cowan's 1st New York Battery. And there's two secrets of the Gettysburg battlefield in regards to this monument. One of them, this gun here, number 107, okay, still has a cannonball stuck in it, okay. It's number 107, made by the same company in Pennsylvania, northeast Pennsylvania, that the first fired cannon of the Civil War was made. If you go back and review my video on the John Buford Monument, you'll see that. It's also an 819-pound gun, as that one was. Cowan's New York Battery, during this action, fired double canister. And what double canister was it was basically, a canister was like a tomato can. It had little balls in it, almost like a shotgun shell. And during the critical moments of the battle, they put two of them in, loaded it with an extra amount of charge, and fired it, wiping out Confederate lines as they approached this copse of trees in the wall. The second secret on this monument is the first and probably only monument, Union monument, here at Gettysburg that honors the Confederacy in some way by having a Confederate flag on the monument. And as you can see there, they honored the Confederate soldiers that were charging toward the wall by placing the stars and bars Confederate battle flag, and then the rest of the bronze monument depicts this particular battery firing their double canister and being led from behind. Now, as we walk around the copse of trees, another little unknown fact is these three markers that you see here. This first one is the 19th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, which the position of this regiment was 119 yards, and it says on the sign, and is represented by its monument. And there is no monument here. These monuments were actually moved. The second one, in the same manner, is the 15th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. And it also says it is marked by its monument. However, there's no monument here, just this old marker. And these are very, very early national park markers that were placed here in the very early 1900s. So I'm not sure to the exact date. I'm sure it's searchable online, but irrelevant for this video. And then the third one is the 20th Massachusetts video. Now, as I take you in here to the copse of trees, there are two witness trees that sit here in the copse of trees, and that would be not this one in the front, but the one on the far right, and then the one on the far left are witness trees. The rest of them are saplings from witness trees. Of course, this area beyond the fence is closed to the park, so you can't get in there. And it, you know, to get in and take a closer look at those trees. There is one strange object, and I'm not exactly sure myself what it is. I haven't done a lot of research on it either. If anybody out there does know, please post that information. But as we go here behind it, there's this very strange looking piece of concrete with, it looks like some kind of all thread or something jammed in through the middle of it. And it looks like it's just been tossed in there. It's been there for some time because the metal rod is rusted pretty bad. I would be interested myself in finding out what that is. If there's anybody out there that knows that, please post that information. Now, again, this area here, known to us today as the copse of trees, to General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, it was known on July 3rd, 1863 as the clump of trees. And as Lee began his battle plans for what would become known as Pickett's charge, from the wooded area here in the distance, 1 mile away, marked there by the Virginia Memorial, which depicts Lee above his troops on his horse, his favorite horse, Traveler. He, in the distance, noticed this clump of trees, which we today know as the copse of trees, and he basically built his battle attack plan around that his 15,000 soldiers in a line would all converge in an angle upon this very place here, and try to split the line of the Federals, and then began to roll them up on each side like a scroll. Of course, though that line was temporarily penetrated on July 3rd, 1863, by General Armistead and some Confederate soldiers and troops, ultimately they were captured, wounded, killed, and the retreat of the of the Confederate Army began back across those fields, back across the Emmitsburg Road, and back to the line that they had begun with, in disaster, with over 6,000 soldiers being killed and wounded, and then spending the night, and then of course the next day on July 4th, Independence Day, 1863, General Lee would order his retreat back toward Virginia. This has been the video on the copse of trees here at the high water mark, and a few secrets regarding the double canister of Cowan's artillery, some missing monuments, some old signs, a strange rock structure inside the copse of trees, and Pickett's charge from the vantage point of the Union soldier here along the breastworks and stone wall of the high water mark, just down from the inner angle on July 3rd, 1863. Okay, this video is going to be done here near sunset, and we're going to talk about Pettigrew's charge on July 3rd, 1863. Very often you hear Pickett's charge, Longstreet's assault, and Pettigrew's charge, which was actually part of Longstreet's assault, but it was here on the right side of the Union line here on Cemetery Ridge on July 3rd, 1863. Of course, to the left down here in this area, off of the Emmitsburg Road, was the attack of Wilcox. And then, of course, further in here in this area, where you see the Lee Equestrian, the Virginia Memorial here, this was all Pickett. And then to the right further over here was Pettigrew under Trimble. Now, Pettigrew's division advanced
with Pickett's, Pickett being over here, as I said. And the two commanders, they joined right around the Emmetsburg Road, right here in midfield. As Pettigrew's men approached the stone wall that you see here in front of us, okay, as they approached that wall, they were shot down by Union fire from the front and the left, forcing the remnants to withdraw back across the field. And at the same time, Federal soldiers attacked Pickett's front on the right, hemming the assaulting Confederates on three sides with heavy fire. So as the Union attack drove Pettigrew's division back, these soldiers here then wheeled in, and now you had fire coming from that direction here, this direction back, and then of course in the frontal direction, assaulting Pickett on three sides and ending Longstreet's assault here on July 3rd, 1863, and of course ending the Battle of Gettysburg, and what is known as the high water mark. But a lot of times you hear Pickett's name or Longstreet's name and you don't really get to hear Pettigrew. And of course, Johnson Pettigrew served under General Trumbull, and it was from these fields over here in front of us that he charged across the field with his men to the stone wall that you see here in front of us. This has been Pettigrew's Charge on July 3rd, 1863 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.